what Muhammad believed because he heard from the glorious deeds of Alexander. And
Hey, Kaylin.
But I mean,
it's not the word of God.
The same thing.
So as you heard from Mike Licona on that on that clip I just played before this video, basically Mike Licona is saying that that Muhammad, who he thinks is the author of the Quran, heard the story of the sun setting in a warm pool or in a muddy spring. Muhammad heard that story and then he put it into the Quran. Now the glorious deeds of Alexander is actually the Alexander romance. I think I don't know why he's calling it the glorious deeds of Alexander, but the name of, I know what Mike Licona is talking about. He's talking about a source called the Alexander romance. So let's call it the Alexander romance just for simplicity's sake. So basically there are a bunch of, there's a few things I'm going to be talking about here. One, did Muhammad copy out the Alexander romance? Two, who is the identity of Dhul Qarynan? Is this Alexander the Great or is it Cyrus of Persia? And three, how it's possible that Cyrus of Persia got mixed up with Alexander? And four, what is the Quran taught? What is the Quran 18? What is the purpose behind the revelation of Quran 18? So let's get into it. First of all, the most common, one of the first criticisms against Islam was that the Prophet Muhammad made up the Quran by plagiarizing local legends and myths. I mean, local legends and myths in Jewish and Christian apocryphal tales. So that was one of the first criticisms against Muhammad in Islam, in the Quran. So basically, anybody who studies the life of the Prophet Muhammad knows that Muhammad was sincere. He was a sincere person who sincerely believed that he was getting revelations from God and he was a prophet of God. Now, if someone was sincere, why would they plagiarize local legends and local myths? It doesn't make any sense to begin with. So basically, we have to ask ourselves, why would the Prophet Muhammad invent a religion like Islam to begin with? What were his motives? What were his motives in inventing a religion like Islam? I mean, he had no motive to do it. And getting back to Prophet Muhammad's sincerity, even like these non-Muslims will say, these non-Muslim scholars or Orientalists or Western academics will say that the Prophet Muhammad was sincere. We read even Sir William Moyer, who was no friend of Islam and no friend of the Quran and Islam, and the Prophet Muhammad, even he said that Muhammad was sincere. In Sir William Moyer, The Life of Muhammad, page 54. And he said that Muhammad was sincere throughout his life in the same book of page 56. And basically John Gilch also said that we can safely reject the view that Muhammad was a deliberate impostor, and that the revelations he was receiving were coming to him from above. John Gilch, Muhammad and the Religion of Islam, chapter, A Study of Muhammad's Personality, Assessment of His Personality. Even William Montgomery Watt, who was again a critic of Islam, no friend of Islam, no friend of the Quran, etc., he says to suppose Muhammad as an impostor raises more problems than it solves. Moreover, none of the great figures of history is so poorly appreciated in the West as Muhammad. William Montgomery Watt, Muhammad at Mecca, page 52. So basically, even non-Muslims say that the Prophet Muhammad was a sincere person, that he sincerely believed he was a prophet of God, and he sincerely thought that revelations were coming to him from God, from above, from God. So then the question really arises, why would a sincere person who actually believed that he was getting revelations from God, as even the non-Muslims attest to, if he was sincere in his beliefs and if he really believed that he was getting revelations from God, why would a God-fearing monotheistic prophet, sincere prophet like Muhammad, plagiarize off those myths, plagiarize off those legends? Why would he do that? It doesn't make any sense. You know, so again, it's possible. It's possible that Durkanin is Alexander the Great. I will admit that, but I'll get into why I think that's not the case in a little bit. Again, it's commonly said that the identity of Durkanin is Alexander the Great, and that the Prophet Muhammad copied off the Alexander romance, either directly or indirectly. Some critics will say, well, he didn't copy off the written source; he just heard it and put it into the Quran. Well, there's a number of problems with that assessment, or there's a number of problems with that theory. First off, we need to see when the Quran, chapter 18, was revealed. Now, according to many scholars, this was revealed in the 6th year of the Prophet Muhammad's prophethood. So 6 years after the Prophet Muhammad claimed to receive revelations from Gabriel, from God, or publicly went out and said he's a prophet. The Quran, chapter 18, was revealed. Now for the reasons for the revelation of the Quran, chapter 18, you should see Ibn Hisham's book, Ibn Hisham, volume 2, page 140 to 164, and page 180. So the reason why the Quran chapter 18, the reason why that whole story of Durkanin was revealed was because the Jews wanted to see if Muhammad was a real prophet or not. If he was a real prophet, he would relate the story of the mighty traveler, the youth who disappeared in the past, and of the spirit. So again, this story is confirmed. The story of the revelation of the Quran chapter 18 was why that surah was revealed to begin with. Was in Ibn Hisham is accounted in Ibn Hisham volume 2, page 140 to 164 and 180. So the Quran chapter 18 was revealed in 615 CE, Christian era. So it was revealed in 615, like max. So the Quran chapter 18 was revealed in 615 CE. So, and again, if you want to know the story of the revelation of the Quran chapter 18 is also recorded in this book. And the account, I know I said Ibn Ishaq's not reliable. I know I said that, but there are some reliable stories in Ibn Ishaq, and this story is authentic. The reason why the Quran chapter 18 was revealed, accounted in this book, is authentic because it's also confirmed in Tafsir ibn Kathir, Tafsir al-Qurtubi, and Tafsir Razi. I'm sorry, Tafsir al-Tabari. So the story of the revelation of Quran 18 is actually authentic in this book, and we read in Ibn Ishaq. The Jewish rabbis said, "Ask him what happened to the young men who disappeared in ancient days, for they have a marvelous story. Ask him about the mighty traveler who reached the confines of both the east and west. Ask him about what the spirit is. If he can give you the answer, then follow him, for he is a prophet. If he cannot, he is a forger, and treat him as you will." So basically, the Jewish rabbis wanted to know what the stories were. They weren't asking whether the stories were true. They just wanted to see what the stories were. So the Prophet Muhammad said, "I'll give it to you tomorrow," and he didn't say inshallah. So then the angel Gabriel came and then gave him the answers. Not 15 days later, as this source and the other sources say, rather tomorrow. Because if you read that Quranic verse, if you read the Quranic verse in the Quran chapter 18, it says the Prophet Muhammad said, or God delayed the response to the pagan Arabs and to the Jews, the next day, because the Prophet Muhammad didn't say inshallah. So that's why, according to Islamic theology, you have to say if God wills, because if you say I'm just going to do something, and you're not saying if God wills, then it's a problematic thing, because God controls everything. The story came the next day, not 15 days later, as some sources say. That part where the Prophet Muhammad didn't answer them 15 days later is a fabricated part. That the Quran says the response was delayed until the next day. But anyways, so basically, let's get back to the Alexander romance. Basically, if we see the Alexander romance, the story of Gog and Magog, we need to see when was the Alexander romance written. when was the Alexander romance with the story of Gog and Magog, when was that written? It's commonly said that the Quran or Muhammad copied off the Syriac version of the Alexander romance. Basically, there's different versions of the Alexander romance going around, in the 1st to 6th centuries. There was the Greek version, the Syriac version, the Armenian version, the Latin version, the Slavonic version. So there's different versions of the Alexander romance going around. There wasn't just one version. There wasn't just one Greek version going around or one Syriac version going around and Europe and the Levant and etc. That's not true. So basically, what the critics say is that the Prophet Muhammad copied up the Syriac version of the Alexander romance. So we need to see if that's true or not. So now we've seen. Now I've just said that the Quran, chapter 18, was revealed in 615 CE. At the latest 615 CE. So we need to know, how do we date, what is the date? What is the date for the written version of this Alexander romance? For the dating of the Alexander romance, I'm going to be using the academic book called Gog and Magog in Early Eastern Christian and Islamic Sources, Salam's Quest for Alexander as well. So what is the date for the Syriac version of the Alexander romance? According to the same book, that the Syriac Alexander romance with the story of Alexander the Great shutting off Gog and Magog with the Iron Wall, it dates from the 7th century. In other words, it's about 85 years after the revelation of the Quran, chapter 18. So about like 85 years, or about 65 to 70 years after the Prophet Muhammad died, that source was written. So basically the Quran chapter 18 came, and then 85 years later, the Syriac version of the Alexander romance was written. So in other words, the Syriac version of the Alexander romance post-dates the Quran chapter 18. It doesn't predate it, it post-dates it. So it was written after not only the revelation of the Quran chapter 18, but after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So the Syriac, Greek, Latin, or Armenian versions of in that same book, on the same page, on page 17 of that same book, it says that the Syriac, Greek, Latin, or Armenian versions of the Alexander romance cannot be considered a source for the Quran chapter 18. Because the Alexander romance story of Gog and Magog post-date the Quran and Muhammad. So in other words, they came after. So the story of Alexander the Great building a wall, an iron wall, to trap Gog and Magog, is actually found is actually not found in the earliest versions of the Alexander the Greek, Armenian, Syriac versions of the Alexander romance. In other words, the Alexander romance containing the story of Alexander the Great shutting off Gog and Magog with iron gates actually post-dates the Quran. In other words, it came after the revelation of the Quran. So the earliest Greek, Syriac, Latin, or in Armenian versions of the Alexander romance don't contain the story of Alexander the Great blocking them with the iron gate. It actually comes from an Eastern Syrian redactor in the 7th century. So it came. So the story. That story in Alexander romance actually came after the Quran chapter 18 in its chronological. So what about pre-Islamic poetry? Some people will say, well, Muhammad copied off pre-Islamic poetry, because there's pre-Islamic poetry going around talking about Dhul Qarynan trapping out Gog and Magog behind iron gate. So I looked into it, and the earliest source I could find is Ibn Ishaq, pages 11 to 12. this book, Ibn Ishaq, pages 11 to 12, talks about the pre-Islamic Dhul Qarynan poem. However, that poem is false. It's fabricated. So let's just go to that page real quick. The poem reads, Dhul Qarynan before me was a Muslim, conquered kings throughout his court. East and west he ruled, he sought knowledge true from a learned sage. He saw where the sun sinks from view in a pool of mud and fleeting slime before him. But please, my father's sister ruled them until the Hupti came to her. So at the bottom of this, the person who's narrating, the person who said this poem was Tupa. Tupa was one of the ancient kings of Yemen. So he wrote that poem. And on page 12, at the bottom, it says, the poem is spurious. It is not difficult to see how Ibn Ishaq persuaded himself to incorporate such an obvious forgery into a serious historical work. So this poem, according to the bottom page of Ibn Ishaq, page 12, is spurious. It's a forgery. So that poem actually was a fabricated poem. It doesn't predate Islam. It actually postdates Islam by by dozens of years after Muhammad died. So this saying that Prophet Muhammad plagiarized pre-Islamic poetry is false, because that poetry was forged after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So the claim that Prophet Muhammad copied pre-Islamic poetry is false, because that poetry is forged anyways. It's not authentic anyways. So does the story of somebody trapping Gog and Magog have any kind of historical veracity to it? Basically, the first people who were talking about the barrier of blocking Gog and Magog were Hellenistic or Greek Jewish circles in Alexandria, which will be in modern-day Egypt, at the beginning of the Christian era. If we read the same book on page 10, the same book I just cited, on page 10, it talks about this. Then Josephus, around 100 CE, Josephus was an important Jewish historian in during the first century of the Christian era. Josephus, around 100 CE, wrote about this trend from these Hellenistic Jews. So he was the first person to write about how someone trapped Gog and Magog behind an iron gate. He writes in his book 600 years before the Quran. He says about Magog and the iron gates blocking Gog and Magog. He talks about how Alexander blocked the Gog and Magog with iron gates from between two mountains. In Flavius Josephus, in Josephus, the Iniquities of the Jews, Book 1, Chapter 6, Verse 1, and the War of the Jews, Book 7, Chapter 7, Verse 4. So basically, if we read the New Testament, if we read Revelations chapter 20, verse 7 to 9, Gog and Magog are associated with the end times, with apocalyptic times. So there was a notion that Gog and Magog, like at least 600 years before Muhammad, there was a notion that Gog and Magog were associated with the end of times, according to the New Testament, according to the book of Revelation, chapter 20, verse 7 to 9. However, the important thing to note here, and this is kind of the deal breaker here, it says the important thing to note here is that there's no evidence that Josephus independently vetted this information about who built the wall. There's no evidence that Josephus fact-checked what those Jews were saying was true or not. So there's no evidence that Josephus fact-checked who built that wall to contain Gog and Magog. Josephus was just repeating what he heard from these Hellenistic Jews around him. And these Jews were saying Alexander the Great built the wall against Gog and Magog. So basically Josephus didn't do any kind of fact checking. He didn't vet the fact. He didn't check the facts to see whether these Jews were whether these Jews were saying was correct or not. He just wrote it down. He just wrote down what he heard from them. So it's very possible that Cyrus of Persia was the one who built the wall, and he was mixed up with Alexander the Great. Now, who was Cyrus of Persia? Cyrus of Persia um, actually fits Dorkarnane's characteristics better than Alexander the Great, because Dorkarnane received revelations and was a monotheist in the Quran chapter 18, verse 83 to 101. Cyrus of Persia, according to the Old Testament, received revelations from God. Uh, Cyrus of Persia is mentioned in the Old Testament in several places. In 2 Chronicles chapter 36, verse 23, the book of Ezra, verse 1 to 8, all the kingdoms of the earth were given to Cyrus of Persia in the book of Ezra, and according to Ezra chapter 1 verse 1 to 8, God would reveal things to Cyrus of Persia according to the Old Testament. And in Isaiah chapter 45 verse 1 to 3, Cyrus of Persia got revelations from God and was familiar with brass and iron, and that's what the Quran says the wall or the gate was built out of, brass and iron. So what about the two-horned Lord? It's commonly said that Alexander the Great was the only person associated with two horns, and that's false, because Cyrus of Persia did have a helmet where he's depicted as having two horns, as you can see in the picture of his tomb. Of Cyrus of Persia's tomb, Cyrus of Persia is shown to have two horns coming out of him. So Cyrus of Persia did receive revelations from God, and he would have definitely ran into the people of Gog and he would have definitely ran into people like Gog and Magog in his travels. That's certainly possible. Keep in mind that according to 2 Chronicles chapter 36 verse 23 and the book of Ezra chapter 1 verse 1 to 8, all the kingdoms of earth were given to Cyrus of Persia. So if all the kingdoms of earth were given to Cyrus of Persia, then Cyrus of Persia would have definitely encountered the people of Gog and Magog in his travels. That's certainly possible. So it's possible, in all intellectual honesty, it is possible that the Quran is really talking about Alexander the Great. That's certainly possible. I'm not going to deny that. That's certainly a possibility. But the critics also have to be honest and say and admit that my theory is true too. That it's possible that the Quran is talking about Cyrus of Persia. That Dorkanane is Cyrus of Persia. After all, according to Josephus, so it's possible that the Quran is talking about Alexander the Great. I will admit that. That's certainly a possibility. After all, according to Josephus' account of Alexander the Great respected the God of the Jews. Alexander the Great even bowed when he saw the Jewish priest. Alexander the Great bowed to him. And when it was asked why Alexander the Great is bowing to the Jewish priest when he went to Jerusalem, he said, "I'm not bowing to him. I'm bowing to the God he represents." So again, it's possible that later on in life, Alexander the Great became a monotheist, or he believed in one God, and God spoke to Alexander the Great. That's certainly possible, because the Quran chapter 18 in the Quran chapter 18 verse 83 to 101, God revealed things to Dorkarnane. Uh, God revealed or inspired Dorkarnane. So, but we know in the Bible, we know in the Old Testament that Cyrus of Persia got revelations. And Alexander the Great's not even mentioned in the Old Testament. But regardless, the Jews were asking the Prophet Muhammad. Now you might be saying, well, why is the story in the Quran when it could very well just be a fictional story? So why is it in the Quran? or it could be a fictional story about Alexander the Great. So why is a fictional story of Alexander the Great found in the Quran? Well, the Jews were asking the Prophet Muhammad what what the stories were. What were the story? What was the story of the mighty traveler? What was the story of the youth who disappeared in ancient times? So the Jews were asking what the stories were, and not whether those stories were true or not. But so basically, if we read uh, this is Yusuf Ali's commentary on the Holy Quran. If we read, it's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful story or allegory is now referred to. Its lessons. So, what is the lessons of the story? Not whether the story is true or not, but what the lesson or what what the what the that it's an allegory or it's a parable. He says that what are the lessons of the story of the sleepers of the seven caves? So basically, it was a story, or the story is an allegory, or it's a parable. It's not it wasn't meant to be taken as a literal historical. These stories of Dhul Qarynan and the Seven Sleepers could be a allegory or a parable, according to Yusuf Ali in his commentary on the Quran, pages 708 to 709. So it's very possible that when the Quran's talking about Dhul Qarynan and seven sleepers, even if these were confirmed to be, you know, false stories or fictional stories, even though there's some historical veracity to them, because there is a cave in Turkey that talks about the seven sleepers that actually has the grave of the seven sleepers. And then there's the wall of Alexander, or the wall of Dhul Qarynan, the wall of Alexander. There are places that say that it was the wall of Alexander that cut off Gog and Magog. So there are places in Russia and places near the Caspian Sea and near the Black Sea where there was like a wall trying to block Gog and Magog. So there could be some historical veracity to those stories. So it's possible that these stories found in the Quran chapter 18 were parables and not intended as literal stories. So because the Quran does have some parables in it, the Quran does have some stories where you can just learn lessons from. It doesn't mean those stories are true. It's just what are the lessons you can learn from those stories. And if we read the Bible, Jesus does talk in parables. For example, according to this Bible, in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, verses 1 to 32, it talks about the parables of or these stories where you can learn lessons from. It doesn't mean the stories are like literally historically true. It just means that what's the lesson you can learn from it. So even if these stories found in the Quran are like false or fictional or whatever, it's just what's the lesson you can learn from it. It's not meant to be taken literally. It's not meant to be taken as a literal fact. It's just what's the lessons you can learn from it. And the Bible has the same thing. For example, Jesus spoke in parables in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15, about the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, the parable of the lost son, or the prodigal son. But these weren't meant to be taken as literal stories. It's just what's the lesson you can learn from it. Same thing. Well, the same thing could be said about the Quran, chapter 18. So if that can be taken for the Bible, if that can be taken for that Jesus spoke in parables and he wasn't speaking historical stories all the time, why can't the same thing be said about the Quran? So I think that's just double standards for anybody who accepts that for the Bible but rejects that claim for the Quran. So this is just my 2 cents about the whole thing about Alexander the Great, about the Quran chapter 18 and the identity of Dhul Qarynan, and whether the author of the Quran, which would be Muhammad, copied off the Alexander Romance. We've seen that the Alexander Romance actually post-dates the Quran chapter 18, the Syriac version that the critics like Michael Licona, the master of, or et cetera, and any other critic of Islam says actually that source postdates Islam. In other words, it was written after the death of Prophet Muhammad. So that source cannot then definitely not be cannot be a source that the Prophet Muhammad copied off of, because it actually came after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. So stay tuned. A lot more videos are up ahead regarding regarding other things I want to talk about. Stay tuned. Thanks.